Welcome everyone to ScienceHolic's webinar. Today we have a professor called Professor Weeks, and here are a few things about ScienceHolic. So, ScienceHolic is a youth nonprofit that aims to introduce intricate scientific concepts in a manner that is fun and comprehensive to teens. Recently, we just published our new magazine edition, so please check it out when you have time. And look out for new webinars that are coming up soon. Okay, ScienceHolic serves as a free resource for students to learn more about science topics, and we strive for teenage readers and contributors to be critical thinkers and promote thought-provoking conversations. We provide various opportunities for students around the world with English as their second language to expand on their English ability and provide volunteer and leadership opportunities to those who want to help others. Here are a few things of Professor Weeks. He's a museum-based biologist, and he uses bird specimens to understand how species are impacted by environmental change. His work focuses on birds of the Solomon Islands, the Midwestern US, and at a global scale. He works with birds because he knows more about them than any other large group of species. This led us ask questions of how the natural system works. His work is less about birds and more about using birds to understand how natural system works. Professor Weeks has not always been an academic researcher. For 4 years after college, he worked as a conservation biologist in the Solomon Islands. That is where he was first introduced to doing work with birds.
我也不认识他。
Attendees, if you have any questions, we can leave it in the chat and we'll go over them at the end of the webinar if they haven't already been answered. Thank you very much. So first questions are academic related. What is the focus of your academic and current career? Is pursuing evolutionary ecology a challenging subject? And how do you balance teaching whilst researching about the environmental changes?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me. It's great to meet you all. And I hope if you do have any questions about anything that you'll feel free to ask. I've had a fairly long career at this point, but I'm also kind of early on as a professor. So I think I have a kind of accessible view of academics, and I'd be happy to talk about anything. So as you think about questions to put in the chat, I hope you'll feel free to ask about anything. This is a great question. I think that pursuing evolutionary ecology is one of the most interesting science fields that you can take on. When I think about what I do, it's largely about trying to understand natural systems. So how are plants and animals and abiotic resources interacting in order to provide the services that humans rely on. And also because it's interesting, it's endlessly complex. There are millions and millions of years of evolutionary history that have created all of these really intricate interactions between different species. And those are complex in themselves. And with more and more species layered on top of each other, those get even more complex. So I think trying to understand the natural world is the most complex of the sciences. And it's wonderfully messy. There's a lot of noise. It's not like physics where everything is perfectly precise. It is a really dynamic and confusing and exciting system. And I think on top of that, it's highly relevant. So even if you're not, a particularly outdoorsy person, maybe you live in a giant city, these are all natural systems are all providing services that you rely on one way or another. So I think it's a really fascinating subject. I think it's really challenging because there are lots of inner working parts. They're really hard to observe. They're really hard to quantify. And I think it's really important. So it matters to our everyday life. It's both intellectually interesting and stimulating because it's challenging, but it's also inherently applied because we're so reliant on services that are provided by natural systems. So I think it's a really challenging subject. And I really got into this line of work. I'm a professor because I like research. So I'm at the University of Michigan, where a lot of our time is expected to be devoted to doing original research. We do teach, and I teach every year. I teach a couple of classes, but most of my time is spent doing research or supervising graduate students who are doing research in my lab. So I would say my balance is mostly skewed toward research. I probably spend 80% of my time working on research, and then about 20% of my time teaching a class on conservation biology and an introductory programming class, so helping students develop skills to do things like evolutionary ecology.
That's great. Thank you so much for answering. And for the second question, what sparked your interest in the STEM fields and inspired you to pursue a career in evolutionary ecology?
Another great question. And I feel like the answer to this for me is unusual and maybe is reassuring for high school students who are trying to think about their careers. I came to this pretty late in life. So when I went to college, I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to write fiction. And I spent the first couple of years in college sort of moving toward that goal. And while I was doing that, I started taking classes in environmental science. And I started to get more and more interested in how humans have impacted the environment, but also how the environment has shaped the development of human society and human culture. And so I started to get more and more interested in kind of the interaction between people and the environment. And I started to think that the environment had this inherent worth. It was worth thinking of as something of value outside of people. And that got me interested in conservation biology. As you said in your introduction, after college, I worked for 4 years as a conservation biologist. So that job was essentially trying to support communities in the Solomon Islands as they tried to develop sustainable livelihoods. So trying to support the development of the economic and social development of rural communities in the Solomons without relying on things like extractive resource practices. So I started to get more and more involved in actually helping to navigate the interaction between people and natural resources. And that just kind of naturally developed into an interest in how those natural systems were functioning. And that's really what the study of evolutionary ecology is. So that's how I ended up here.
There's an attendee question that we put in the slide. What's the most exciting part about studying and now researching about ecology?
That is a great question. I think the most exciting part for me is the discovery, the moment of discovery. So I have an example of this. So I think it was Newton had a famous line about weighing and measuring. If you want to understand the world, you weigh things and you measure things. And I've spent a lot of my career weighing and measuring things. And one of the projects that I've been working on recently was looking at how birds have changed through time. And so as a part of that, I looked at a series of bird specimens that had been collected over the past 40 years. So these are birds that were migrating through North America. And as they were migrating through a big city in the middle of the US, they crashed into buildings. And every year, a certain number of birds would crash into buildings and die. And a guy went out and picked them all up and measured them and put them into the Natural History Museum in Chicago. He did this for 40 years. And over the course of 40 years, he measured over 70,000 individual birds. And we were able to look at those birds and look at the measurements and look at their size. And all of a sudden, we noticed that they had all gotten smaller through time. So this was 50 different species of birds, a huge number of birds. They were all really different. They were coming from different places in South America or Central America. They were going to North America, but they were all going to nest in different places. They have different behaviors. They have different evolutionary histories. And there was this universal pattern across all of these species where they were all getting smaller through time. And we were able to link that to increasing temperatures. And all of a sudden, there was this moment of discovery where we realized, oh my gosh, all of these common species that we thought we knew so well have been changing right in front of us, and we hadn't known for 40 years. So I think that's the most exciting moment, where you have this moment of discovery, and you figure something out about how the world works that no one else has known before. And I think that's the most exciting part about doing research. And I think that's true of ecology, just like any other STEM field probably, where you have these periodic moments where you're the first person ever to know something. And it's just a really exciting and inspiring moment. So it takes a lot of work to get to that point, but when you get there, it's hugely rewarding.
I'm sure it also requires a lot of patience. Or,
Yes, definitely. A lot of patience and a lot of trial and error. Yeah, it is it's a hard thing to do, but it's very rewarding in the end.
our next question is, what is one memorable experience throughout your research or teaching career?
I've had a lot of really wonderful experiences through my career. So I think a lot of people think about STEM fields as being fields that take place in the lab, like in this picture on the slide. And for a lot of people, that's true. For me, I've always been interested in working in natural settings. So most of my work actually takes place out in natural systems. So I do a lot of work in rainforests. I do a lot of work in the forests of North America. And as a consequence of that, I get to be in amazing places and interact with lots of amazing plants and animals. And I remember probably my earliest really vivid memory of an extremely unexpected and remarkable and memorable experience that was associated with my research was probably my first time doing field work in the Solomon Islands. So I went to the Solomon Islands a lot to work with people as a conservation biologist. But then when I started graduate school, I was going to study the birds of the Solomon Islands, which was a little different. And in the Solomons, most of the people live down on the coast in the islands where I was working. And then there are these big extinct volcanoes that you know, they have a lot of elevation. They go from coastal rainforests all the way up to these elfin cloud forests where everything is covered in moss, and it's wet all the time. It's always in the clouds. And you go through major changes in the types of plants and animals that are there. And I remember the first time that I went to an island called Kolombangara, which was one of these extinct volcanoes, to do research. And I was going out in the morning before the sun came up, and I would go to a particular point, and I would wait until the birds started calling in the morning, and then I would do a survey to see what species were there and how many individuals were there. And I remember the first night that I went out, so I got up, it was still dark out, and I started walking through the forest, and I realized that there were all of these fungi on the trees that were glowing in the dark. And I grew up in Ohio in the United States, and I had never been to a rainforest before. And it just blew my mind, the insane diversity of these amazing species that I had never experienced before. I remember there was just a flood of that. I saw plants with no roots. They're way up in the tops of trees, and they have these big bulbs at the bottom. They're called ant plants, and the bulbs form these perfect habitats for ant colonies. And ant colonies will live in there, and they'll go down to the ground and forage, and then they bring things up to the plant. And they're using the plant as a place to live, and the plant is using the ants as a means of getting nutrients from the ground up to these plants way up in the trees. So there were all sorts of just amazing kind of natural history moments, experiences where it was just sort of moments of being blown away by how cool the plants and animals of these systems are. So I think that was probably the earliest really memorable experience that I've had. But there were lots of things like that, like, you know, going from island to island in boats with flying fish next to me, all sorts of stuff like that's happened in my career. And like I said, I grew up in the middle of the United States. I didn't travel much as a kid, and this career has taken me all over the world. And it's just been incredibly memorable to see all these new natural systems and try to understand how they work. So it's actually my most memorable experience through research and teaching isn't actually about research or teaching. It's about exploring and discovering all of these new places around the world.
That's interesting. And for our next question, what is your favorite part of studying and working in STEM?
That's another great question. And it's a really hard question to answer because I think there are a lot of really rewarding parts about working in STEM. And like I talked about before, that moment of discovery when you're doing research is really exciting. But I also really like working with the people that I work with. So I get to work with a lot of collaborators who range from graduate students who are just starting their career in STEM, or undergraduates who work with me and are just discovering what it means to do academic research, all the way up through much more senior professors who've been professors for 30 years and really have a great handle on the field and the history of the field. So one of my favorite parts about working in STEM is actually working across all of these different levels of researcher, from the earliest career researcher up to these very senior researchers, and being able to mentor people and be mentored by people. I think it's great to just be continually learning. It's one of the real joys of an academic STEM career is you're always learning new things. It's not repetitive at all. And so I love that. And I love the freedom to ask whatever, I have the freedom to ask whatever questions I want and try to understand the different things that I want to understand. So I think my favorite parts of it are actually working with other people, and the fact that I get to learn about whatever it is that I want to learn about. I also really like that it's taught me how to think about the world. So when I think about questions, whether it's, should the world be electrifying our cars or anything like that, I now come at it from a perspective and through an analytical framework that is completely informed by my job. So I think about things through, through kind of a hypothesis-driven and data-based framework that I've been developing as a part of my profession for the last 15 years. So those are some of my favorite things about it, but it really is hard to pick a favorite. I love my job. I think I'm just incredibly lucky to do it. I love that, I can't believe that I get paid to ask questions that I want to ask and try to answer them and travel around the world and work with interesting, cool people who are motivated to just help us improve our understanding of the world. So I think that's a really great part about working in STEM.
Now for some general questions on career paths and advice to give. What does your typical day look like?
That's a surprisingly hard question for me to answer. My days are very variable. I guess they kind of fall into 3 different categories. So most of the time I'm not teaching. So I'll go to my office. I have a group of students who I'm supervising. And usually I have a research project that I'm working on. So for example, right now I'm trying to understand how bird skeletal morphology has evolved across space. So to do that, I worked with a computer vision expert to measure bird skeletal traits from images of bird skeletons. We've collected a huge database of different attributes of bird skeletons. So I would go in the morning and I have a couple of hypotheses that I'm trying to test with these data. So I will do some sort of data analysis throughout the day. Maybe I have a manuscript that's a little bit further along, so I'll be writing up a paper summarizing some results that I have. So I like to spend the morning doing my own research, whatever that might be. And then in the afternoon, I usually check in with my students who I'm directly supervising. So I'll reach out to my graduate students and talk to them about their projects and how they're going, and help them with their analyses or help them with the papers that they're writing. And then at the end of the day, I like to read the literature. So every day papers are getting published in my field. And so I like to try to stay on top of what's new in the field. So I'll spend the afternoon reading. So that's a pretty standard day. Other days I'll be teaching, so I'll come in and I'll have to prepare for a class. So maybe I'll spend the morning and a little bit of the afternoon getting a lecture ready, and then I'll give the lecture to a class, and maybe I have some grading to do. That's a smaller portion of my time, but sometimes I have to do that. And then in the summers, it can be really varied. So sometimes I'll be, in Ann Arbor, where my university is, and doing research. Other times I'll be out in the field studying birds in their natural habitats. So, I spent a couple of weeks recently traveling around Kyrgyzstan, trying to understand bird communities and how they change from one mountain range to another. So we spent a few weeks driving through the country, going up into these mountain areas and studying the birds, and then driving back to desert areas and going to the next mountain range and driving up in there. So it can be really varied. It's a really nice mix of research that happens in the lab, thinking about like statistical modeling or doing genomic sequencing. It can be teaching, or it can be field work where I'm out in the field actually collecting data in natural systems. So it's hard to say what a typical day is. It's very varied, which is one of the things I really like about it.
Yeah, that's great. So that not every day is the same and then it's not boring.
Yeah. Yep.
And our next question is, what advice would you give to high school students who are considering a career in STEM fields?
Yeah. My advice is to keep an open mind. So I think that the STEM fields are really varied. So engineering is really different from what I do. Technology, like the study of technology, is really different from what I do. And I think that my job is way more fun, way more interesting, and way more important. And so I think that if you're going into the STEM fields, I would keep as open a mind as you can. I would take as many classes as you can from fields that you're not familiar with. So take an ecology class. I didn't know what ecology was when I started college. I didn't know really that you could have a career studying birds until after college. And so I really benefited from realizing that I was interested in STEM, but not being sure exactly what I wanted to do, and keeping an open mind about what classes to take and what career paths I might want to follow in the end. And I think that if you do that, not only are you likely to end up in a field that you find more interesting and satisfying, but I think you'll be better at what you do. So I really think that the people who love what they do end up doing a better job at it. And I think the way to figure that out is to realize that you're just at the beginning of your careers, and you could do anything. And so keeping an open mind about what that means, and what options you're looking at, I think is really important as you sort of transition from high school into college. The other thing that I would recommend, that I can't recommend highly enough, is as soon as you get into college, I think it's worth realizing that the situation has changed for you as a student. There are now lots of professors, and your teachers are not just teachers. They're also doing research. And if you think you might be interested in research, you should definitely reach out to a professor whose research you think is interesting and try to work with them. My transition into STEM from wanting to be a writer, which was a good move. I'm a terrible writer, as much as I would like to be good at it. My transition into STEM happened because of one faculty member. I reached out to him in the second year of college and asked him if he needed anyone to work for him for the summer, and he gave me a job. He gave me a job digging soil pits at an experimental forest, and it was my first experience doing any sort of scientific research. It was my first exposure to an academic research lab, and I loved it. And he gave me a job for one summer. I went back the next summer, and it completely changed the trajectory of my life. And so I think as you go into college, one thing you can do is to look at your teachers not just as people who are teaching classes, but look at them as people who also have an interest in research, and find someone whose research you think is interesting and try to get involved with them in their group. And it doesn't really matter exactly what you're doing. just getting involved in that process and getting to know the people who are doing that type of work and figuring out what they're doing and how it all works, I think is a really important and valuable way to start a career in STEM and make sure that you end up doing something that in the end you'll be happy doing. So that's my biggest piece of advice as you transition from high school to college. And I found that really hard to do. I went to kind of a crappy high school. I wasn't used to having people teaching me who were particularly engaged in education, and no one was doing any research. And so it was a totally new world for me. And I think it's hard to sort of put yourself out there and try to reach out to someone and ask for them to engage with you as a student, but it's definitely worth doing. And it might be that you ask someone and they never respond to your email or whatever. But I would encourage you to keep trying. And it really just takes that one person who, takes an interest in you, decides to foster your interest in STEM, and really shows you how to excel as a researcher. So that's my biggest piece of advice. And in terms of choosing a major, to the extent that it's possible, I would wait to do that. I think getting a really well-rounded education early on in college can be really valuable, and it can help you end up in a field that you're most interested in. If you're trying lots of different stuff, you can figure out what really sparks your interest. It can also provide a lot of nice context for your field as you move forward and become more and more specialized. It's good to have kind of a broader context. So I feel like there's a lot of pressure these days to know what you want to do right away and to get started on that. But it worked out really well for me to kind of take my time and survey broadly across everything that a university has to offer, which is just an amazing array of stuff. And then eventually, you sort of get drawn into something that catches your interest. I think that's the way to do it. If I were doing it again, that's how I would do it again. Yeah. And then your main focus in high school, again, I think thinking broadly and keeping your options open, not deciding ahead of time what you want to do with your life, recognizing that there's a whole world of options. Not all of them are standard. You don't have to be a lawyer or like a medical doctor, which is what I thought when I was going to college. Like, those are those are the career paths that, my family would have been really excited about. And when I got to college, I discovered that there's a whole world of possibilities. And so I think that starts in high school, engaging with all of your classes and thinking of yourself as a whole person with whole varied interests, I think is really important and will serve you well going into college.
Thank you for the piece of advice. It's
Sure.
really helpful, actually.
Good.
For our final question is, what kind of student would be a good fit for studying ecology, and how can one start working in evolutionary ecology?
That's a great question, and I think it's a really important question. I think that there is no one type of student who is a good fit for ecology, and I think that's true across fields. I think all too often we think about the perfect student for a field, especially being someone who is similar to the people who already work in that field. And I don't think that that's the case. I actually think that everyone is different, and we all bring something different to our work and to research. And I think that's true in ecology, just like any other field. And when I think about that in terms of myself, I think that I'm an unusual ecologist. I was not interested in memorizing things. I wasn't interested in the typical introductory biology courses where you're focused on molecular biology. Organic chemistry would have been just a total nightmare for me. I just didn't find that type of learning and doing interesting. And a lot of ecologists do come from that background. They are kind of your classic STEM student, where they knew from the beginning of high school that they wanted to focus on microbiology or whatever, and they maybe transitioned a little bit into ecology, but they have that same mindset. I don't have that at all. And so I think one of the most important things to keep in mind as you enter university or finish high school and start to think about your career is that you can do whatever you want. And you will be a good fit for that. You're going to bring your particular set of skills and interests to whatever field you pursue. And whether or not those are identical to the skills and interests that other people in that field have is irrelevant to whether or not you're a good fit for that field. I would argue it's even better if you're a bit of an outsider. So you bring some sort of unique perspective to a field. So I don't think that there is a good fit for a student studying ecology. I think the one thing that you have to be, if you want to do research, is be curious. You have to be interested in discovery. You have to be trying to figure out new things. And as long as you want to do that, I think you're a great fit for the field of ecology. The other thing that is irreplaceable is trying hard. So I think anyone who comes to the field of ecology with curiosity and a desire to learn new things about how the world works is going to be a great fit for the field. In terms of how do you get started in this type of field, I think, again, when you start college or as you finish up high school, I think the most important thing you can do is to expose yourself to new fields and new things. So you might not have a class on ecology in high school. I certainly did not. But that doesn't mean that you can't start to think about natural systems. It doesn't mean that you can't start to learn the birds in whatever place it is where you live. It doesn't mean that you can't start to think about plants. It doesn't mean that you can't start to read literature that's focused on the natural world. So I would start to engage in both science and humanities that are associated with natural systems, and just start to get steeped in the idea that the world is an incredibly complex and fascinating and exciting place. And if that speaks to you and you want to learn more about it, you can shift to focus more on that in your coursework. You can also reach out to faculty in your university, ultimately, wherever you are, who are doing research on ecology, and try to have experiences working with people who are actually doing research. So I think those are, the theme of everything I've been saying is think broadly and then reach out to people who can mentor you and be persistent about it. And don't worry about whether or not you're a good fit for something. Don't worry about whether or not you already have the skills to do something. The whole point of being a student is to learn those skills and to discover if you're interested in something. So I would be, bold in asking people if you can work with them. And I would be open-minded about what it is that you're trying to pursue. I think those are what make you a good fit for studying ecology and how you get started studying ecology.
Thank you. And now for some questions. I believe we have a question that was posted in early on in the chat.
Okay.
It's by Lawrence Yan. How does climate change impact birds or their habitat?
It's a fascinating question. That's mostly what I research. So I can tell you a little bit about my research, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what we know as a community. So my research is mostly focused on how changing temperatures have impacted the morphology of birds, so the size and the shape of birds. And essentially what we've found, what it boils down to, is that rising temperatures are shrinking birds. So as temperatures have warmed, birds have gotten smaller. And that's really important. Body size is probably the single most important trait of almost all animals. It determines how they contribute to the functioning of ecosystems. It determines how different species of animals interact with each other. It determines how individuals of the same species interact with each other. So it has all sorts of really widespread consequences. And it turns out across systems, whether it's in North America or in the Amazonian rainforest, as the world has warmed, those warming temperatures have driven reductions in size across birds. At the same time, this is where it gets kind of funky, as birds have gotten smaller, they've also gotten longer wings, which is weird. You would think as birds got smaller, their wings would get shorter. So you have this kind of shape of a bird, and as it shrinks, you kind of expect it to maintain the same shape. So the wings would get smaller so that they were the same relative length to the body size. But that's not what happens, or it's not what has happened anyway. As birds have gotten smaller, their wings have gotten longer, and we're still trying to figure out why that is. The hypotheses are that there's a kind of a pattern where birds with long relative wings are more efficient flyers. So the idea, one idea is that as birds have gotten smaller, they've had to become more efficient at flying, because if you're smaller, your metabolic rates are faster. So if you want to be able to fly while you're small, you kind of need long wings or you run out of energy. So that's one idea. Another idea is that birds actually lose a lot of heat through their wings when they're flying. So as the world has gotten warmer, one idea is that their wings have gotten longer in order to enable them to lose heat. So you can think about this like when you go jogging outside, if you're really hot, you kind of have to stop and cool down. And it's the same thing with birds. When they start to fly, their metabolism goes through the roof. And all of a sudden they're generating huge amounts of heat, and they have to get rid of it, or they have to stop flying to cool down. And so one idea is that their wings might be getting longer to enable them to lose more heat as the world gets warmer. But we don't really know. You're right at the cutting edge of the world's knowledge about climate change impacts. And one other thing that I'll point out is that even if you don't care about birds, which to me is crazy, you gotta love birds, they're amazing. But even if you don't, the reason that they're so fascinating, I think, is because they're one of the only study systems where we have enough information to answer these questions. So if you wanted to know, for example, how does climate change impact insects, you would not be able to answer that question. We don't have enough information to answer that question. So we actually don't know how the world is changing. But we can start to get a sense of it by looking at birds, because we have so much information about birds. So they're really kind of a test case for us to understand natural systems more broadly. So while I hope that everyone is loving birds and obsessed with them, even if you're not, what this really means is that lots and lots of species around the world probably are getting smaller as the climate is changing. And we need to understand what the impacts of that change are, and we just don't know at the moment. So that's my piece of the field that I work on. There are other people who study other climate change impacts on birds. And the general finding is that as the world has warmed, the ranges of birds, so where you find them, have moved toward the poles. So they've kind of tracked the same environmental conditions. So as the world gets warmer, species have moved away from the equator and towards the pole so that they stay in the same temperature. And we've also seen that the timing of repetitive life history events, so things like migration or reproduction, are shifting to track the temperature conditions. So they happen in the spring, they tend to happen earlier in the year so that they're happening in the same kind of temperature envelope. And those are sort of the three general responses to climate change that are happening across birds, but they're also happening to fish. They're also happening to plants. So these are very general responses to climate change. That's a wonderful question. It's one of the most, I would say, pressing questions in evolutionary ecology right now. And lots of people are working on it, and we're starting to get a sense for it, but it's a really, really challenging question to answer.
Thank you for answering. If there's no more questions. Oh, okay. There's one more from Emilio. What was a memorable moment of discovery?
So I have had quite a few of those, and I can't tell if they're very exciting to me and will be very boring for you, or if they'll be exciting for you too. But I'll try to tell you a couple of different ones that I think hopefully you'll find exciting and interesting. So the first one is a little technical, and I'm telling it to you because it just happened, I think last week. So I've been, for the last 2 years, I've been collecting data on bird skeletons. So we have natural history museums around the world that have collections of dead birds in them. So at the University of Michigan, there are 250,000 dead birds. About 25,000 of those are skeletons. So they're in little boxes, like playing card boxes, and they've been collected over the past 150 years or so. And people haven't really worked with them because they're really annoying to work with. They're little boxes of tiny little bones. They're all jumbled together. And so if you want to measure things about those bones, it's hard to do. But today, all annoying tasks apparently can be done by computers. And so it's this cool moment in history where we've been collecting skeletons for hundreds of years with some idea that someday they'll be useful. And now we can teach computers to identify bones in those skeletons and measure them for us. So it's just this perfect moment in time where all of a sudden we can generate a bunch of data on skeletal dimensions of birds using cutting-edge computer technology. So I've been working on this for the past 2 years, and we finally have a bunch of data. So we've been taking pictures of bird skeletons and teaching a computer to identify bones and then measure different aspects of those bones. And I finally got all the data. So I've gotten data for about 14,000 specimens of birds. And I started looking at them. And when I was answering Lawrence's question, I mentioned that one theory about why birds' wings are getting longer is that they might be needing to dissipate extra heat from those wings. Well, bird wings are interesting. Only part of them is vascularized. So only part of the wing actually dissipates heat. The rest of it is feathers. That's just like your hair. You don't lose any heat from your hair, but you do lose heat from your head where you have vascularized tissue. And bird wings are the same way. So for the first chunk of their wing, there's a bunch of meat in there, and they're giving away heat from that part. And then for the second chunk, it's just feather, and they don't lose any heat at all. And people have been studying bird wings for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years because we're totally fascinated by flight, apparently. And we have been throughout history. So we thought we knew everything there was to know about bird wings. What structures bird wings, why they are the shape that they are, why are there no birds that are 100 pounds? We know all this stuff. We've developed a theory about the physics of flight. We've looked at the evolution of bird wings, and we've never looked at the length of the bird feathers in comparison to the length of the vascularized tissue on bird wings. And I was able to do that last week for the first time and discovered that the proportion of the wing that is vascularized is extremely strongly predicted by temperature. So when you see a bird in a warm part of the world, much more of its wing, a greater proportion of its wing is vascularized than if you see a bird in a colder part of the world. So in other words, it does seem to be the case that the need for birds to dissipate heat from their wings has driven the evolution of wing structure across all birds. So I thought that was fascinating, and it blew my mind that there's this really clear pattern that we had never been able to see before because we didn't have the data. And it's just a fundamental aspect of bird morphology for thousands of species around the world. So I thought that that was a cool moment of discovery, but I also recognize that that is a very esoteric and probably not as cool for you moment of discovery. So I have one other cool moment of discovery that might resonate a little bit more. When I was just starting out in the Solomon Islands, I had a mentor who was an ornithologist. So he studied birds. This was before I studied birds. And he told me that there was this flightless bird that was living in the Solomon Islands that nobody really knew anything about. And so he told me to go and try to find them. He sent me to this island. This was back when my job was to work with people and try to, negotiate arrangements with school funding contracts and things that were not that related to natural systems. So this was a real departure for me. And he sent me to this island. He said, go try to find these birds, and then go to this other island and try to find them there. And so I went to these two islands in the Solomons, and I had a little recorder, and I went out in the mornings and tried to find these flightless birds. And they're flightless rails, so they're kind of chicken-like birds that run around on the ground. And they've gone extinct in almost all of the Pacific. But in the Solomon Islands, they're still there. And so I went to these 2 islands and recorded the different calls. And there was one island where we knew that this bird existed. And then the next island was one where we didn't really know if it was there or not. So I went to this other island and recorded the call of this bird. And so first I got to discover that they were there. And then I took the calls home and I played them, and they were totally different. And it turns out that not only were there flightless rails on these 2 different islands, but there were different species of birds. And there was a species of bird that had never been described. And it was just living happily on this island in the Solomons, and had never been described, and is totally new to science. It's not named, it's just a new species. So that was another memorable moment of discovery that was very early on in my career and has stuck with me for the last 10 years. But it's a great question.
So that's really interesting. A flightless bird. Another question from Emilio. She said, "Thank you so much. Also, what do you recommend for us to do to help climate change?"
Oh, it's a good question. There are lots of things to do because it's a big problem. I think that one thing to do, and one thing to recognize. So I have spent my career studying natural systems, and a lot of my research is focused on the impacts of climate change. And a lot of my research is focused on trying to understand extinction risk, and to predict extinction risk. And I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is, I think, to be optimistic. So natural systems are very resilient. They go through a lot of change. They can respond to change, and they can adapt to change. So I've seen that in my work. Birds are being impacted by climate change, but they're not static. They're getting smaller. They're changing their shape. They're adapting to novel conditions. So natural systems are resilient, and I think there's cause for optimism. They can recover. They are still mostly here. We hear a lot about being in an extinction crisis, and we certainly are at the front end of an extinction crisis, but it hasn't happened yet. There hasn't been that much extinction. So we're headed in the wrong direction, but there's still time to reverse course. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that it's not hopeless. It's not a done deal. We can still influence the world, and we can still mitigate the impacts of climate change on natural systems. So I would maintain a sense of optimism. I would also keep a sense of urgency. It's a problem, and it's a very real and important problem to address. But it's not that we can't do anything. Okay, so that's my spiel about staying positive. But I also think that if you're worried about climate change, it's important to think about why you're worried about climate change. So for me, I worry about climate change because of the impact that it will have on species. I don't want species to be driven extinct by climate change. So my goal is to reduce extinction. And when you think about extinction, there is far and away one driver of extinction that's more important than anything else, and it's not climate change. It's habitat loss and modification. So the one thing that we're doing that's driving species extinct and reducing population sizes more than anything else, including climate change, by a lot, is habitat loss and modification. So if you're worried about climate change because you're worried about extinction, I think the thing you can do is recognize that it's a complex problem. Climate change is impacting species at the same time that they're being impacted by habitat loss. And one of those is much more addressable than the other. And one of them has much less attention being paid to it than the other. And that's habitat loss. So if you really want to prevent extinction, and you really want to stop population declines, and you really want to mitigate the effects of climate change, I think the thing to do is to focus on reducing habitat loss. And that's going to provide species with kind of the flexibility that they need to respond to climate change. So I think it's great that we're, as a global community, focused on addressing climate change. I think that's a huge issue, and we should all be aware of that. And I think it's also important, as early career people who are interested in STEM, you are the people who are going to have the understanding, the nuanced understanding necessary to recognize that it's not just climate change that matters. Climate change is interacting with things like habitat loss to drive extinction, and we can mitigate the effects of climate change in creative ways, like protecting habitats in a way that allows species to move as the climate changes. So I think the thing that you should do, because you are not a typical citizen of the world, you are someone who's interested in STEM. You're someone who is going to understand these things well enough to bring this nuanced recognition of the multivariate drivers of extinction that exist. And so you can see climate change as a part of a broader puzzle and a part of a broader problem, and help to address some of those other kind of neglected parts of the puzzle. So I know it's kind of a cop-out, like has less to do with how to address climate change and more to do about how to mitigate the effects of climate change. But I think that's actually the answer. I think we really should be focusing on other things that are either magnifying or reducing the effects of climate change on natural systems. And those are things like habitat loss. So if you want to reduce the impacts of climate change, I think the thing to do is to protect habitat in some.
Thank you. If there's no more questions, can we please say a thank you to to Professor East for joining us?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me. And good luck, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so
all
much for your time.
look into ecology and have wonderful evolutionary ecology careers.
Thank you so much for your time. We're incredibly grateful.
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
We'll
Nice to
end
meet
the
you.
webinar here.
Okay.
It was nice to meet you here too. Thank you so much again.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.